Hi, I'm Pastor Kurt, and this is your 5-minute Bible study. Today, we're going to look at Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 4, verse 25. Before we get into the text, though, let me say a little word about how the rest of these videos are going to go. In the first section of these videos for this year, I talked about the book of Acts. And I was able to look at smaller sections of the text as we looked at the narrative of the early church as described in the book of Acts. Well, now that we're getting into the letters of the New Testament, I have to talk about them in sort of a broad sense and look at larger chunks of the text. Sometimes, though, when we get to the smaller letters, I'll kind of group some of those together. So this won't be the same kind of breakdown that I did for Acts, but it'll still cover the material. So here we go. This section in Romans is the beginning of the book of Romans. Paul has given some greetings. He's given some thanksgiving for the people there in Rome who are receiving this letter. And he starts off after that by telling them that he's not ashamed of the gospel. He's not ashamed of telling people about Jesus and his crucifixion and resurrection, which fits exactly with what we heard in the book of Acts. If you remember, during Paul's trials, he was accused of all sorts of stuff, but the thing that he pleaded guilty to was telling people about Jesus and the resurrection. He's like, yes, I have done that. I will continue to do that. And now in this letter to the people in Rome, he's admitting to them, he's like, I'm not ashamed to tell you about Jesus. Now remember, the book of Acts ended in Rome. And now this letter is a letter to the people in Rome. So in a way, the story does continue on here. It continues through Paul's letter now. After he says that he's not ashamed of the gospel, he comes right out and tells his readers that none of us live the way God wants us to live. All of us fall short. All of us are broken, sinful people who don't do what God wants. In Lutheran theological terms, we call this the law. The law, is that which points out our sinful nature to us. It reminds us about how we're messed up, how we screw up, and how we don't live the way God wants. This is important. We need to be honest about how we are broken, sinful people. Some people don't want to talk about that. They want to say, oh yeah, I make mistakes from time to time like everybody does. But they don't talk about sin. They don't talk about our brokenness. They don't talk about our rebellion against God. But we need to admit that. We need to admit how we do not live the way God wants us to live. And this is what Paul does at the beginning of the book of Romans here. He reminds his readers, like, okay, none of us live the way God wants. And then the law then drives us to Jesus. This is where we find mercy and compassion and forgiveness. But we need to pay attention to why we turn to Jesus. And Paul spells this out here. We do not turn to Jesus because Jesus protects us from God. Sometimes people talk about that. They say that God is basically out to get you, but Jesus gets in the way on purpose. It's almost like Jesus is the divine Secret Service agent who jumps in front of the bullet for you. No, okay? Paul is telling the people in Rome and telling us today who are reading this letter now that the reason we trust in Jesus is because Jesus reveals God's righteousness to us. Okay, what's that word righteousness? Usually when we hear the word righteous, we automatically think of self-righteous, which we think of as being arrogant or full of yourself. That's not what the word righteous means, okay? Being righteous simply means that you are made in right relationship with God. Or, let me say it this way. It is God's goodness that God then gives to you. And God gives it to you through Jesus. This is why we trust Jesus. This is why we follow Jesus. Because through Jesus, we see God's love and mercy and grace given for us, given for you. In Lutheran theological terms, this is called the gospel. The law points out how we're all screwed up, how we don't live the way God wants, and we need to be honest about that. And we also need to be honest about how much God still ridiculously loves us. Even though we are messed up and broken and sinful people, God still loves us. This is justification by grace through faith. We are made in right relationship with God, justified, because of God's gift of grace. This is God's doing, not ours, given to us through the gift of faith, which God also gives to us. So we do not make ourselves in right relationship with God. God does that. And it's wonderful, especially given that we are so broken and sinful. God says, even though you're messed up, I still love you. And I'm going to show you my love through the person of Jesus. That's why we trust Jesus. That's what Paul was telling the people in Rome why they should trust Jesus. And that's today why we trust Jesus too. There's your 5-minute Bible study. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.